Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss direction of travel on Brexit again, as the Tories show that despite a more cooperative mood between the government and the EU, they're still going backwards, increasing divergence instead of realising that they're just causing more damage. The retained EU law bill is now passing, and amongst other things, it is lowering our food safety standards. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So, when Rishi Sunak agreed the Windsor framework with the EU earlier this year, it represented a huge change in government policy. Ever since the 2016 referendum, the Tories have turned their back on the EU and moved the UK away. There was never any thought given to the different types of Brexit possible due to the very different reasons that the slender majority of voters elected to leave. No, it was going to be a hard Brexit from day one, and the Tories have pursued this policy mercilessly. Even after we left the EU, and then unnecessarily the single market and customs union, and saw the consequences of it, the government under Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss continued to push divergence. Then Rishi Sunak not only struck an agreement with the EU, but seemed much more comfortable describing them as allies. There was no more language of being competitors, even though we now are as a third country. The UK government was no longer turning its back. It was turning to face the EU. And this was huge, and it still represents a huge change. Notwithstanding the very obvious feelings within the Tory party, I imagined we might also shuffle a few steps towards them as well, recognising the consequences of the deeply damaging divergence. We've gone too far. The Tories may have been thinking, let's just readjust back a little bit and then see from there. Sunak won an overwhelming endorsement for his Windsor framework in Parliament, with the Tory rebellion petering out into less than 24 votes against. We could push on from there, join Horizon, kick the retained EU law bill into oblivion, maybe further convergence from there. But alas, it was not to be. We're still messing about with Horizon, still not happening, despite scientists telling the government that every delay is proving costly. And as for the retained EU law bill, although it might have been reduced in scale, it is nonetheless passing now. It's done. It's going to be law. And it means scrapping hundreds of rights and standards without a document anywhere which lists exactly which ones are for the chop and what the impact assessment for each is. It's like Rishi Sunak has turned us to face the EU, great, but he's walking backwards. This week, the House of Lords ended its battle with the government over the retained EU law bill. Peers were trying to make sure that environmental and food standards would be maintained. The government persuaded them to drop their demands on food standards in return for agreeing to the environmental standards. The upshot being that ministers will not be able to regress environmental protections, at least I hope not, as I understand it, but the food standards are completely vulnerable. The government insists that the clause wasn't necessary to maintain food standards, but we've heard it all before. When we left the EU, Boris Johnson took various rights and standards that were supposed to be enshrined in law from the legally binding portion of the withdrawal agreement, and he moved it to the non-binding political declaration. He said, it's not necessary to make these standards legally binding because I'm not intending to lower standards. Several years later, the standards are certainly lower. I mean, you only have to take a trip to the beach only to be told, sorry, you can't go near the sea because you may encounter that poo you did this morning. You only have to do that to realise how much lower our standards have sunk. But we've also lost personal rights and freedoms in both the workplace and in society. So forgive me if I don't trust the government not to lower food safety standards without a legislative guarantee. And if the government didn't want to lower standards, why did they fight so hard to remove a clause designed to maintain them? So we're now going to see hundreds of rules and regulations chopped by ministers without any parliamentary approval. Because that's what this legislation does. It gives the executive, who are not elected, the power to change or remove laws without seeking approval from the elected legislature. It represents a complete abdication of responsibility on the part of MPs to be allowing this executive overreach. But it also represents a retrograde step once again. And it's a step that pleases nobody. The swivel-eyed loons, they're upset because we are only destroying hundreds of rights and protections without any parliamentary scrutiny or impact assessments. They wanted thousands gone. And those with a measure of sanity are appalled that we're removing any rights and protections without having worked out what the impact would be. Are you insane? Oh, yeah, you are insane. Sorry, I forgot. The Daily Express report on the proceedings this week didn't seem to know whether to be happy or upset. On the one hand, they enjoyed describing the House of Lords as backing down to their Brexit overlords, but it also sounded a note of reticence itself that it wasn't really Brexit because we're still going to have some rights left at the end of it. But it's also worth making sure people understand the full implications of this. See, I say the government have persuaded the House of Lords to drop objections to food safety standards, and you think, oh, that means we're going to see lower standard food for sale in Britain. Yes, that is what's going to happen. Lower safety standards, that means it's more likely to make people ill, absolutely. But that is not the full implication. Every time we lower our standards, goods being exported from Britain to the EU represents a higher risk to the single market. Because although the documentation will say, oh no, this is the high quality stuff that you like, it's like, unless you check in the box, you don't know, do you? So that means mitigations have to be increased. More trade friction, basically. Abolishing hundreds of standards is giving the EU hundreds of reasons to raise trade barriers in order to protect their own market. This will further harm our balance of trade. We're still going backwards. It's clear that all the framework was, the Windsor framework to Rishi Sunak was just a political win. He became leader of the party. He had no authority. He needed to show he could achieve something. No one really believed he was an election winner. He needed something. Being seen to have dealt with the Northern Ireland Protocol, which Boris Johnson floundered on for years, was his quick win. To show his party could solve problems that his predecessors could not. Not that he strictly solved it, but he has dialed down the political heat. Well, between Britain and the EU anyway. Northern Ireland is still paralysed. Almost looked like the DUP were getting ready to find a face-saving way out, but they're asking for unicorns again. We'll see what happens after summer. But since the Windsor framework, it's been like business as usual for the Tories. There hasn't been a change of direction of movement. We're still diverging at an alarming rate. The only difference is we're managing to do so without being unnecessarily rude to our European neighbours. I noticed even Ian Duncan Smith now seems to have stopped whining at the EU for a moment, has decided to attack America for Brexit's problems instead. There were some, after the Windsor framework, who were anti-Brexit but desperately looking for a way of justifying keeping the Tories in power, who were quick to point out that the Tories were going to become a rejoined party and leave Labour stuck in the Brexit mud. Oh yes. Care to explain this then? I mean, don't get me wrong, the Tories will become a rejoined party. Indeed, it will be impossible to rejoin until they've done so. But it will be when it becomes an electoral imperative. And Labour are making the electoral imperative happen more quickly. As I keep saying, not only are they promising to converge where the Tories are still diverging, they're expanding the electorate to include younger voters who are mostly pro-EU and long-term settled EU citizens who are also. This is not a party that is a Brexit party. There is no future in which the Tories will converge until they are faced with electoral reality for their Brexit behaviour. Keep them in power and they will keep doing what has kept them in power, which is Brexit. But it looks like Labour are going to have to make more groundwork when they do form a government. I don't mind saying that although I kept saying that the Tories were not going to make great strides in reversing their damaging Brexit divergence, I did think they might at least stop moving further away. Maybe shuffle back a bit with Horizon. But since then, it's just been further backwards. No sign of reversing anything at all. And we probably have another year of this as well. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.